He built the porch before he built the roof. 2 chairs, side by side. On a stretch of Kansas prairie where the nearest neighbor was 4 miles of nothing, and the wind never once stopped talking. People called him a fool. They said a man alone on the frontier had no business saving a seat for someone who didn't exist. But Gideon Hartwell wasn't saving a seat. He was making a promise to a woman he hadn't met, in a city he'd never seen, about a life neither of them had dared to believe was possible. This is the story of what happened when she finally came, and what it cost them both to get there. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this reaches. Hit like, and stay with me until the very last word. You won't regret it. The land didn't care about him. That was the first thing Gideon Hartwell understood when he drove the last stake into the hard Kansas ground and looked up at the sky and felt nothing looking back. No welcome. No resistance either. Just the flat, indifferent expanse of the tall grass prairie stretching out in every direction like a thought that never finished itself, rolling toward a horizon that kept moving no matter how far you walked toward it. He was 29 years old. He had 160 acres under his name, a mule named Chester with a bad left ear, $43 tucked into a coffee tin buried under the floorboard of a house that didn't have a roof yet, and the particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself all at once. It just settles in, slow and quiet, like dust after a storm. He'd come from Missouri. His father had worked a dry farm there for 30 years and had nothing at the end of it except cracked hands and a bitterness that soaked into everything, including the people around him. Gideon had watched that happen, had watched his mother go quiet by degrees. Not sad exactly, just worn down to something essential, like a bar of soap used past the point of lather. He'd promised himself at 15 that he would not build that kind of life. Whatever he built, it would be worth something. It would mean something. He just hadn't entirely figured out what yet. The Homestead Act gave him the land. Hard work gave him the start of a structure. But the part that nobody talked about, the part the government pamphlets left out when they were selling the frontier as opportunity, was that there was nobody to talk to at the end of the day. Nobody to tell you if the north pasture looked right, or if the well smelled off, or if the thing you thought was funny actually was funny, or if you'd just been alone so long that your sense of humor had started entertaining itself. His nearest neighbor was a man named Arlo Pemberton, who lived 4 miles east and seemed to regard conversation as a form of physical exertion he'd given up in his 40s. The man would ride over to trade seed and stand in silence for 10-15 minutes before saying something like, "Rain's coming," and then riding back. Gideon liked Arlo in the way you like something reliable, but you can't build a life on reliable silence. So Gideon built. He built because it was the only thing that made the days feel like they were going somewhere. He poured himself into the work with the focused energy of someone outrunning a thought he didn't want to catch up with him. He cut sod and laid the walls. He dug the well 30 feet down through clay and limestone until his shoulders burned and his hands were raw. He cleared a half acre for a kitchen garden and tilled it twice and planted squash and beans and the tomato seeds he'd carried all the way from Joplin in a folded square of cheesecloth. He built a small barn for Chester and the 2 cattle he'd traded 3 weeks of labor to acquire. A sturdy brown cow he called Ruth and her daughter, still too young to name properly. And one afternoon in late July, when the heat was so absolute that the air itself seemed to have given up moving, he built a porch. He built it before he finished the roof. That was the part that got people talking. Hank Kraus, who ran a modest operation 6 miles west and fancied himself something of a community voice, came by one afternoon and stood at the edge of the property, watching Gideon nail the last planks into place with the particular purposeful rhythm of a man who has decided something. "The hell are you doing?" Hank said. Not unkindly, just directly, the way men talked out there. "Building a porch," Gideon said without looking up. "You don't have a roof. Porch doesn't need a roof to be a porch." Hank looked at the house, looked at the porch, looked at the 2 chairs Gideon had already set out. Simple things, wood and rawhide, nothing elaborate, sitting side by side facing west where the sunsets came in long and red and enormous every evening. "You expecting company?" Gideon set down his hammer, looked at the chairs, thought about it for a second, the way he sometimes did when a question was simpler than it seemed. "Not expecting," he said. "Just ready." "Ready for who?" He picked the hammer back up. When she gets here, I'll introduce you." Hank stared at him for a moment. Then he turned his horse around and rode west, and that was the story he told at every dinner table and gathering for the next 3 months. Gideon Hartwell, who had 2 chairs on his porch and no wife, and not enough sense to finish a roof before decorating the front of a house he wasn't done building. Some people laughed. Some people shook their heads. Old Martha Jennings, who was 72 and had buried 2 husbands on this prairie and considered herself an authority on what the frontier did to a man's mind, told her daughter that the boy wasn't crazy. He was just lonely in a way that hadn't broken him yet. She didn't say that like it was a compliment, more like a warning. Gideon finished the roof in August. The porch stayed. The chairs stayed. On the evenings when the work was done and the light was coming down golden and long across the grass, he'd sit in his chair, always the left one, for reasons he couldn't have explained, and look west and think. Not sad thinking, not even hopeful thinking, exactly. More like the particular mental state of a man who has already made up his mind about something and is now simply waiting for the rest of reality to catch up. He wasn't naive about it. He understood the situation he was in. A man alone on 160 acres in the middle of the Kansas frontier was not, by the standards of most sensible people, a romantic proposition. The work was brutal and endless. The weather had no mercy and no pattern you could count on. The nearest town, a small settlement called Harlan's Crossing, about 12 miles south, had a general store, a post office, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a church, in roughly that order of usefulness. There were women in Harlan's Crossing, but they were already settled into lives, and Gideon wasn't the kind of man who thought you could build something real by inserting yourself into someone else's existing story. He wanted to find someone who was, like him, looking for the kind of life that didn't exist yet. Someone who would look at this raw, difficult, beautiful stretch of ground and see not what it was, but what it could become. He'd thought about this more carefully than most people would have guessed from the outside. He'd made a kind of mental list, not of qualities exactly, but of questions. Things he'd want to know about a person before he spent his life with them. Not whether she was pretty or whether she could cook or whether she'd been properly raised, which were the things men in his circle tended to talk about when the subject came up. His questions were stranger. Did she think hard work was a burden or just the texture of a meaningful life? Did she get frustrated when things were unfair, and what did she do with that frustration? Did she have opinions about things and say them, even when saying them was inconvenient? Was she afraid of silence, or could she sit in it without filling it with noise? He didn't know anyone to ask these questions to, not out here. So in September of 1879, on a Tuesday when the first genuine chill of autumn came in from the north and reminded him that winter was not a metaphor, but an actual problem he would need to face in about 6 weeks, Gideon Hartwell sat down at his small table by the window and wrote an advertisement. He wrote 7 drafts. The first one was stiff and formal, in the way of a man who doesn't often write things down, and is compensating by using too many words. The second one was too short and read, he felt, like a livestock notice. The third tried to be funny and wasn't. The fourth and fifth were somewhere in between, honest enough, but missing something. He couldn't say what. Some quality of realness, some indication that the person behind the words was an actual human being with dust on his boots and specific opinions about specific things, and not just a representative of the category frontier bachelor seeking wife. The 6th draft he burned because he'd been trying too hard to sound like someone else. The 7th draft he wrote at about 11 at night by lamplight, slightly tired, slightly cold because he'd let the stove go low, and he wrote it the way he actually thought, which was the only reason it worked. It read, Homesteader, Kansas. 29 years, seeks a woman of genuine character for correspondence, and, if both parties agree after honest exchange, for partnership in marriage and in life. I have land, 160 acres, a house with a roof now fully intact, a well, a kitchen garden, and a beginning. I have no money to speak of. I have no family here. I have work, and I believe in it, and I do not think it beneath either of us. I am not interested in a woman who wants to be taken care of. I am interested in a woman who wants to build something. There is a difference. I have 2 chairs on my porch. One is occupied, the other has been waiting. I am not a sentimental man by nature, but I find I cannot bring myself to remove it. If you are the kind of person who reads this and feels something other than amusement, I would be grateful for a letter. I promise to answer honestly, whatever you ask. Write to G. Hartwell, care of Harlan's Crossing Post Office, Harlan's Crossing, Kansas. He read it over twice, thought about revising it, decided it was as honest as he knew how to be, which was either enough or it wasn't. He rode into Harlan's Crossing the next morning and mailed it to 3 newspapers, one in St. Louis, one in Chicago, and one in Philadelphia, which he chose mostly because he'd read once that Philadelphia had a strong tradition of printing and therefore presumably a high density of literate people who read newspapers carefully. He rode home. Did not think about it. Put it out of his mind the way you put your hand out over a flame. Briefly, just enough to know it was there, then pull back before it costs you something. He had a roof to properly seal before the first frost. He got to work. 23 women wrote to him. He was not prepared for 23 women. He'd been prepared for 5, maybe. 7 at the outside. 23 arrived over the course of October, in a rush that made Walt Briggs at the post office look at him over the counter with an expression that was part amusement and part something harder to name, something like respect, or maybe the recognition of an experiment that was working better than anyone expected. "You're popular," Walt said, handing over the stack. "Apparently," Gideon said. He read all 23 letters that night by lamplight, with Chester nosing at the barn door outside, and the wind doing its usual prairie business with the dried grass and the loose corner of the outhouse roof he still hadn't properly nailed down. Most of the letters were kind. Several were sincere. A few were clearly written by women whose circumstances were difficult and who were looking for any door out, which Gideon understood but could not honestly answer, not because he didn't feel for them, but because desperation and desire were not the same thing, and he'd watched his father marry a woman who was grateful instead of happy, and he knew how that ended. 3 letters he read twice. 1 he set aside for a second consideration, and one he read 4 times, getting up once to pour himself a small amount of the whiskey he kept for exceptional circumstances, and then sat back down and read it a 5th time. That one was from Philadelphia, Chetterlam. Tsintam. She hadn't introduced herself immediately. That was the first thing. Most of the other letters began with the woman's name, her age, her situation, her qualities as she understood them. Organized, like a resume, like she was applying for a position. Which, in some sense, she was, Gideon understood, and he didn't fault any of them for it. But this letter started with a question. What do you mean by build something? That was the first line. No preamble, just that. She went on. I ask because men use that phrase differently than they mean it. Some mean they want labor without acknowledgement. Some mean they want someone to admire what they've already built. Some genuinely mean a partnership, which is a rarer thing than the word suggests. I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because the answer matters to me considerably. My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 26 years old. I live in Philadelphia. I work in my father's print shop, which I have largely been running for 2 years since his health became a problem, because I am the eldest of 4 children and the only one with a serious disposition toward numbers and deadlines. This is not a complaint. I am telling you because it is the truth of my situation, and you said you wanted honesty. I read your advertisement 3 times before I decided to write to you. The first time I thought you sounded strange. The second time I thought you sounded sincere. The third time I thought, a man who would write about an empty chair and call himself unsentimental is either a fool or exactly the kind of person I've been looking for, and I'd like to find out which. Tell me about the second chair. Not where you bought it. Tell me why you put it there. M. Ellison. Bob. Gideon sat with that letter for a long time. There was something in it that worked on him in a way he didn't have clean language for. It wasn't that it was charming, though it was in a sharp, undecorated way. It was more that it read like someone who had decided that honesty was the only strategy worth attempting and had committed to it fully and early. No performance, no softening, just, here are my actual questions, asked directly. Here is who I actually am. He picked up his pen and wrote back that same night. His reply was longer than he'd expected it to be. Miss Ellison, in answer to your question about build something, I mean the third one, the partnership. I understand why you'd want to clarify. I've seen the other versions and they're worse than being alone, which is saying something given my current situation. The second chair. You asked why I put it there. Honest answer, I'm not entirely sure I can explain it in a way that doesn't make me sound either foolish or overly dramatic, and I'm trying to avoid both. But I'll try. I built the porch in July. It was 102 degrees, and I was tired, and the house still wasn't finished, and I was at the particular edge of a long day where you either quit early and feel worse for it, or you do one more thing that means something. I went looking for lumber to start the porch steps, and I found I had enough for 2 chairs. Not the steps, just the chairs. So I built them. I built the second one because I did not want the porch to look like what it was, which was a man alone on a piece of ground in the middle of nowhere, waiting for a life to start. I wanted it to look like a life that had started, like someone had just stepped inside and would be back shortly. Practical? No. Honest? Yes, which I believe you'll appreciate more than practical. I've had 3 neighbors come by and comment on those chairs. All 3 of them thought it was unusual. None of them asked why I did it. You're the first person to ask. For what it's worth, that's not a small thing to me. G. Hartwell. Bashachab. She wrote back in 10 days. He wrote back in 5. She wrote back in 8. By the 3rd exchange, they had stopped being careful with each other. Not reckless. Neither of them was built that way. But the particular formality of 2 people measuring their words had started to give way to something faster and more direct. They talked about work, about what honest work felt like and what dishonest work felt like, and the difference between being tired at the end of a day because you'd done something real versus tired because you'd spent 8 hours pretending to do something real. She talked about the print shop with a frustration she'd been keeping somewhere quiet and hadn't known she was carrying until she started writing it down. There's a man, she wrote in her 4th letter, who has been placing the same weekly advertisement for 11 years, roofing and carpentry. He pays on time and he's always polite, and I have no complaint about him as a customer. But every time he comes in, he speaks to my assistant, Thomas, when he has questions, even when I'm standing right there with the answers. He's not a cruel man. He just does not see me as the person in charge. Thomas is 20 and has been with us for 8 months and still confuses leading type with body type. And this man asks him questions and takes his answers seriously, and then I correct the answers, and the man looks at me like I've said something impolite. I'm telling you this not to complain, but because you asked in your last letter what frustrates me. That frustrates me. The quiet assumption of smallness. I am not small. Gideon read that paragraph twice. Then he wrote in the margin of the letter, not to send back, just for himself, "No, she is not." And then he wrote his reply. "I believe you," he wrote. "I'd like to see someone try to look past you on my property. I expect they wouldn't do it twice." She wrote back, "That may be the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 3 years." November arrived and the prairie turned a color that was almost orange in the afternoons, the dried grass catching the low light and holding it in a way that was genuinely beautiful if you were in the mood to notice it and genuinely desolate if you weren't. Gideon was usually in the mood to notice it. He'd found over the months out here that the land rewarded attention. It was not soft and it was not forgiving, but it was specific in a way he respected. It had its own character, its own rhythms, its own particular ways of telling you what it needed. You just had to watch. He told her this. He told her about the color of the grass in November. He told her that the first hard freeze had come through and he'd lost most of the tomatoes he hadn't picked yet, but had salvaged the squash and that the beans had done better than expected, and that Chester had developed a habit of leaning against the barn door at exactly dusk every evening, which he couldn't explain but had started to find reliable in a way that comforted him. She wrote back about Philadelphia in autumn, about the way the city smelled when it rained, ink and horses and coal smoke and something under it all that was just the smell of a lot of people living close together, which was either overwhelming or reassuring depending on the day. She wrote about her sister Clara, who was 17 and quick with figures and had a talent for making people feel noticed, and her brother James, who was 14 and had opinions about everything and was exhausting in the best possible way. and her younger sister Nell, who was 9 and collected feathers and kept them in a box under her bed and could tell you which bird each one came from. She wrote about her father. She was careful about it, the way you're careful about things that are actively hurting you. He is a good man, she wrote. He built the business with his hands and his stubbornness and very little else. He taught me to read type by feel before I could see it well enough to distinguish the letters by sight. He has always treated my opinion as worth having, which is rarer than it should be. This illness, it is a slow thing and not kind. Some days he is himself. Other days he is somewhere I can't reach him. I try not to let him see that it frightens me. I don't always succeed. Gideon wrote back, "You don't have to protect me from the hard parts. I asked for honest letters. This is what honest looks like." She replied, "You're the only person I've been able to say that to. I'm not entirely sure what to do with that." He read that line several times. Then he set the letter down and went out onto the porch and sat in the left chair and looked at the right one and felt something shift in him that he couldn't have named precisely, but that had to do with the specific and growing certainty that he was not writing to a stranger anymore. December. The letters slowed slightly because the post was unreliable when the weather was bad, and December on the Kansas prairie had its own view of reliable. 3 weeks could pass between letters if a storm system sat over the region long enough. Gideon had not realized until those gaps how thoroughly he had structured his internal life around the arrivals. He didn't like discovering that. It felt like a vulnerability he hadn't elected to have. On the Sunday before Christmas, which he marked by doing no work and eating a slightly better meal than usual, which was his version of celebration, he rode into Harlan's Crossing to collect mail and buy lamp oil and a sack of cornmeal, and found, waiting for him, 2 letters from Philadelphia, which had arrived together because the previous week's delivery had been held up by weather. He sat in the post office and read both of them right there, which Walt Briggs observed without comment but with the expression of a man filing information away for future use. The first letter was ordinary. Her account of the shop in the week before Christmas, the rush of orders, a story about James accidentally setting fire to a small stack of paper because he'd brought a candle too close and then had grabbed the wrong thing to put it out. Nothing serious. Told with the particular dry humor she deployed about family chaos, which he'd come to recognize as a sign that she'd processed the stress into something she could carry. The second letter was different. "I've been thinking about something and I'm not sure how to write it without sounding like I've lost my practical mind entirely. So I'm going to write it exactly as I think it and trust you to read it in the spirit intended. When I started writing to you, I was curious about you. Specifically, the way you would be curious about something unusual, something that didn't fit the expected shape. A man with 2 chairs and no sense of priority. I'm not merely curious anymore. I don't know what that means, practically speaking. My father is not well and the shop requires me, and I have 3 younger siblings who are not yet fully capable of managing without me. These are not small things, and I'm not asking you to dismiss them. But I thought you should know, because you keep saying you want honesty, and I keep providing it, that when I imagine the life I want to be living, it has started to look considerably less like Philadelphia. This frightens me a little. Thought you should know that too. Mom." Gideon read it twice, folded it carefully, put it in his coat pocket against his chest, not the outer pocket with the other letter, the inside one. He rode home in the cold with Chester moving at his usual unhurried pace and the sky coming down gray and massive overhead, and he thought about what she'd written and what it cost her to write it and what it meant that she had anyway. That night, he wrote the longest letter he'd sent her yet. He told her he understood about her father. He told her he wasn't asking her to leave. He told her that what was happening between them, whatever this was, this strange and specific thing they'd built out of ink and paper across 1,000 miles of winter, was worth whatever time it needed. That he hadn't built the second chair because he was impatient. He'd built it because he was certain, and those were different things. "I am not going anywhere," he wrote. "The chair isn't going anywhere. Take the time you need. Do what's right by your family. But don't tell yourself you have to decide between them. That's not a decision I'm asking you to make. The Kansas winter is long," he continued, "and I found I don't mind it as much as I expected. The cold is honest. It doesn't pretend to be something else. I can respect that. Write when you can. I'll be here. G." He sealed it, rode back to Harlan's Crossing the next morning in the kind of cold that worked its way through every layer, and mailed it. Then he went home and fed Ruth and her daughter and checked the well, which was starting to ice over at the edges, and made himself a meal that was functional rather than inspired, and sat at the table afterward in the lamplight with the particular quiet of the Kansas winter pressing down around him. It was not comfortable quiet, but it was honest quiet. He'd learned to tell the difference. Dumb. January came in hard. A blizzard in the second week of the month dropped 18 inches over 3 days and sealed Gideon into the house with nothing but his own company, his cattle, Chester, and his thoughts for 6 days before the weather broke enough to clear a path to the barn. He spent those 6 days doing the things a man does when he's stuck inside, repairing what needed repairing, mending the harness Chester had worked through at one buckle, reading by lamplight the 3 books he owned, a surveying manual that he'd read twice already, a collection of agricultural essays from a university in Ohio that contained some genuinely useful information buried under a considerable amount of self-congratulation, and a novel his mother had pressed into his hands the last time he'd seen her, which he'd been saving without fully knowing why. He read the novel during the blizzard. He was not accustomed to reading novels. He found it absorbed him in a way he hadn't expected, the particular experience of caring about people who weren't real, who had never been real, but who somehow made the room feel less empty anyway. He thought about Margaret while he read it. Not because the story had anything to do with her. It was set in England, of all places, which was about as far from the Kansas prairie as imagination could stretch. But because there was a woman in the novel who said what she thought at every opportunity, and who everyone around her found inconvenient, and who turned out, by the end, to have been right about most things all along. He thought she might like that. He thought he'd like to ask her. He was thinking about her more than he thought was strategic. On the 6th day, when the snow finally showed some mercy, he dug himself out and checked on the cattle and found that Ruth and her daughter had come through fine, which was a relief, and that a section of the barn's south wall had taken some damage from the wind, which was not. He spent the afternoon fixing it with boards he had to dig out of the snow behind the barn, working in the kind of cold that made his fingers slow and stupid inside his gloves, and required him to think deliberately about each motion to make sure he was doing it right. When he was done, he went inside and washed his hands and heated water for coffee and sat at the table, and for no particular reason he pulled out Margaret's last letter, the one that wasn't fully ordinary, the second Christmas one, and read it again. When I imagine the life I want to be living, it has started to look considerably less like Philadelphia. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was clearing from the west in the way it did after a plains blizzard, abruptly, completely, as if the storm had simply lost interest and moved on. The light came back in long and cold and absolutely clean, the way only winter light could be after that much snow, and it lit the porch and the 2 chairs and the white prairie beyond them in a way that made the whole scene look like something deliberate, something composed. He didn't think of himself as a sentimental man, but he sat at his table in the cold kitchen light and looked at the second chair through the window and felt something that was maybe closer to grief than hope. The particular ache of wanting something to be real that wasn't real yet and might never be, and having to keep going in the meantime and trust that the in-between was worth something. He got up, poured his coffee, got back to work. That was, he had come to believe what faith actually looked like. Not certainty, not ease, just getting up, pouring the coffee, getting back to work. The second chair sat in the January light and said nothing, which was exactly what it always did, and which he had stopped expecting to be otherwise. He wrote her a letter that evening about the blizzard, about the novel, about the woman in it who was right about everything and inconvenienced everyone, about the barn wall, about Ruth and her daughter who didn't have a name yet, and how he'd been thinking she might let him name the young one after her. Not Margaret, which felt too formal for a cow, but something from her letters, some small word she'd used that stuck with him. He wrote, "There's a word you used in your 3rd letter describing what good work felt like at the end of a good day. You called it rightness. I've been thinking about that word for months. I think it's the best word I've heard for it. So maybe I'll call her rightness. It's an unusual name for a cow, but you'd probably approve." He mailed it when the roads cleared, 4 days later. She wrote back in 2 weeks. Name her rightness. Absolutely. I'm honored. I've never had anything named after me before. Certainly not livestock, which I mean as the highest possible compliment given the circumstances. How is she? How are you? The blizzard reached us in a lesser form, Sig. 8 inches, 2 days, the city grinding to a halt in the way cities do, with a great deal of complaint and not much of the stoic adaptation you seem to manage. I ran out of coffee on the second day, and that was, I think, the true crisis. I told my sister Clara about the novel, about the woman. She wants me to get her a copy. Write soon, Cher M. Spring came the way spring came on the prairie. Not gently, not gradually, but in fits. A warm week in March that made you believe it, followed by a late freeze that took out the first shoots of the winter wheat and required Gideon to make some decisions about replanting that cost him both time and money he didn't fully have. Then, in April, the real thing. Warmth that stayed, rain that came in the right amounts, the grass coming back green and dense and immediate the way only prairie grass could, as if it had been waiting underground all winter just looking for permission. Rightness, the young cow, who had turned out to have a calm and observant personality that Gideon found oddly appropriate, was doing well. The kitchen garden was going back in. Chester's bad ear had gotten worse and then inexplicably better. The south barn wall was holding. The letters kept coming. 7 months in, they had covered work, family, faith, or its absence. Both of them circled this carefully and approached it from different angles without fully committing to a position which Gideon thought said something true about both of them. Politics, briefly, with some disagreement that was bracing and healthy. Books, food, the particular character of the light in their respective locations at different times of day, what they were afraid of, what they wanted, what they regretted, what they'd do differently. They had not talked about what they were to each other, not directly. There was an understanding that they were moving towards something without either of them saying so explicitly, the way two people walking in the same direction eventually just fall into step without a discussion. Then in May, Margaret's letter arrived late and was shorter than usual and had a quality of restraint he didn't recognize, a flatness behind the words that wasn't her. My father has taken a significant turn. The doctor is saying months, not years, probably fewer months than we'd hoped. I am telling you because you asked for honesty and because I have nobody else to say it to this plainly. I don't know what this means for things. I can't think about that right now. I'm sorry. M. Bushitam. Gideon wrote back the same day he received it. He didn't write much. He'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could offer was brevity. Not because the situation was small, but because it wasn't, and elaborate words could sometimes make grief heavier instead of lighter. He wrote, "I'm sorry. He sounds like a man worth grieving properly. Don't apologize to me, not for this. I'm here. That doesn't change. G." He sealed it and rode to Harlan's Crossing and mailed it and rode home and fed the cattle and sat on the porch, in the left chair, always the left, and watched the sun go down over the Kansas prairie and thought about a woman he'd never seen, in a city he'd never visited, sitting beside a father who was leaving, and felt the particular helplessness of caring about something that was too far away for any of his efforts to reach. The second chair was empty beside him. It had always been empty beside him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went inside and made dinner and banked the stove against the cool May night and went to sleep because there was nothing else he could do, and in the morning he would get back to work, because that was what you did. The land didn't care about him. But he had come to understand, in the 8 months since he'd mailed that advertisement into the world, that he cared about considerably more than the land. The question of what to do with that was the hardest question the frontier had ever asked him. He didn't have an answer yet, but he was still in the chair, still waiting. The summer of 1880 came in hot and indifferent, the way Kansas summers always did, and Gideon worked through it the way he worked through most things, by keeping his head down and his hands moving and his expectations modest enough that the days couldn't disappoint him too badly. He'd learned over the past several months that hope was a thing you had to manage carefully on the frontier. Too much of it, and it became a kind of recklessness, the emotional equivalent of planting a full crop the week before a drought. Too little, and the days turned gray in a way that had nothing to do with weather. The trick was keeping it at a level that was useful without being consuming. And that trick was harder than it sounded when you were also waiting for letters from Philadelphia that sometimes came in clusters and sometimes didn't come at all for 3 weeks. Margaret's father, Edwin Ellison, died on a Thursday in the first week of June. Gideon knew this because the letter arrived 11 days later, and she'd written the date at the top in a handwriting that was slightly different from her usual, more controlled, the way handwriting gets when the person holding the pen is working hard not to shake. Thursday, June 3rd, it began. My father passed this morning at 7:30. The shop was closed. The whole street was quiet, in that particular way Philadelphia gets when the weather is between things. Not yet summer, not quite spring anymore, just gray and still. I was with him. That part was good. She wrote 3 paragraphs and then stopped. The letter ended mid-page in a way that suggested she'd intended to write more and then run out of whatever she was running on. Gideon wrote back that afternoon. He told her he was sorry. He told her he was glad she'd been there. He told her that the particular quiet she described, that between weather stillness, sounded right somehow, like the world had paused for something worth pausing for. Then he wrote, "When you're ready to talk about what comes next, for you, for the shop, for everything, I'm here. There's no deadline on this end, I mean that." He mailed it and went back to the summer work and tried not to think too hard about what comes next actually meant, because every time he pulled at that thread it unraveled into questions he didn't have answers to and couldn't get answers to without her. And she was 11 days away by mail on a good week. So he worked. He expanded the kitchen garden. He traded 2 weeks of labor with Hank Kraus in exchange for the use of Hank's plow horse for the north field, which he wanted to break for wheat before fall. He patched the outhouse roof, finally, definitively, with actual nails driven at actual angles, and felt a satisfaction about it that was slightly out of proportion to the task, which was the kind of small, irrational pleasure the frontier offered when it wasn't offering hardship. Her next letter came 3 weeks later. It was longer. She had, she explained, spent the first 2 weeks after her father's death simply keeping the shop running, because the shop had customers and deadlines and paper stock that needed reordering and a 17-year-old assistant who was trying his best, but who needed someone to tell him what best looked like in practical terms. She'd worked herself through the grief in the way she apparently worked through most difficult things, by making herself useful until the useful became a rhythm and the rhythm became bearable. "I've had to make some decisions," she wrote. "The shop can be sold. There's a buyer who has approached us, a man named Hargrove, who runs a printing operation on Market Street and has been watching our location for 2 years apparently. He's offered a fair price, maybe slightly below fair, which is the kind of offer you make when you think the seller needs to be out more than they need the extra $100. My brother James is 15 now, old enough to apprentice somewhere. Clara is 17 and clever and can be placed in good employment. She has already been asked by a family on Spruce Street if she would consider a position as a household manager's assistant, which is a better offer than it sounds. Nell is 9 and needs a home and a school and someone to make sure she eats regularly. I'm not telling you this to be dramatic. I'm telling you because these are the actual pieces I have to move before I can move myself. And I want you to understand what I'm actually working with. It is not simple. I'm not going to pretend it is." Gideon read that letter twice at the kitchen table and then a third time out on the porch in the chair he always sat in. The second chair was still there. Rightness had wandered close to the fence line and was watching him with her usual expression of mild philosophical contemplation. He thought about what to say back. He thought for 2 days, which was longer than he usually needed. The difficulty was that he wanted to say come. He wanted to say it simply and directly the way he said most things, because it was what he meant, and he was not a man who found value in elaborate indirection. But he understood, had understood for months, probably since December, since she'd written about the life she was starting to imagine, that the distance between what he wanted to say and what it was right to say was a distance that required navigation. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was explaining her situation with the particular precision of someone who needed to be understood clearly before they could decide anything. The worst thing he could do was respond to that precision with sentiment. The second worst thing would be to say nothing meaningful. He wrote, "I hear you on the pieces, and I want you to know I'm not standing here holding my breath. You don't owe me a decision. You don't owe me speed. What you owe yourself is the chance to get those pieces settled without pressure from this direction. And I'm telling you flat out that there is no pressure from this direction. But I'm also going to tell you something honest, because you've earned that, and because not saying it would be a kind of lie by omission that I don't think either of us is interested in. I have been writing to you for 9 months. In 9 months I have come to know how you think, how you argue, how you treat people who are less careful than you are, and how you talk about your family, which tells me how you'll eventually talk about whoever becomes your family next. I know what you're afraid of and what you find funny and what kind of tired is the good kind and what kind isn't. I know how your mind works when it's working hard and when it's being careful and when it's being honest. I don't know your face. I don't know your voice. I don't know if we'll sit across a table from each other and find out that everything on paper evaporates when there's actual air between us. But I'm willing to find out. I've been willing since sometime around the fourth letter. I'm telling you that now because it seems like the kind of information you should have when you're trying to decide what to do with your pieces. Whatever you decide, I meant what I said. The chair isn't going anywhere. G. She did not write back for 4 weeks, which was the longest gap since they'd started. He did not let himself interpret it. He worked. He harvested the first wheat from the north field. Not a great yield, but real solid grain in actual sacks, which felt like proof of something. He sold it at a small profit and used part of that money to buy proper window glass for the 2 back windows that had been covered with oil paper since the previous winter, which had been fine in terms of keeping the wind out but had made the back rooms dark in a way that occasionally depressed him. When the glass was in and the light came through it clean and solid in the late afternoon, he stood in the back room and looked at the light on the floor and thought that this was what it felt like to improve something slowly enough that you stopped noticing it was getting better until suddenly it was noticeably better. He thought Margaret would understand that thought. He thought about telling her when she wrote. She wrote on a Wednesday in late September. He got the letter on a Friday and stood at Walt Briggs's counter in the post office and recognized her handwriting and felt something in his chest that was too specific to be called hope and too restrained to be called relief, and then took the letter outside to read in the clean fall light because he wanted to read it in air, not indoors. "I'm sorry for the silence," she wrote. "I needed to think without writing, which is harder for me than it sounds. Writing to you has become the primary way I process things, and I was worried that if I kept writing, I would write my way to a decision I hadn't actually made yet. Here is where I am. Hargrove has the shop. We agreed on a price that was neither as high as I wanted, nor as low as he wanted, which is how fair actually works most of the time. The transfer is complete as of last week. James has an apprenticeship with a cabinet maker on Chestnut Street who is a good man and knew my father. Clara is placed. Nell? Nell is the harder one. She is old enough to understand that things are changing and young enough to be frightened by what changing means. And I have spent the last month sitting with her in the evenings before she goes to sleep and letting her talk herself through it and trying to be the thing she can push against without falling over. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I have not been idle. I have been arranging, and now most of the arrangement is done. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer it directly, and I need the answer to be actually true and not what you think I want to hear. I've noticed you're capable of that kind of diplomacy when you think it's kind. I'm asking you not to be kind right now. If I came to Kansas, if I actually came, actually stepped off a train and appeared in your life as a real person with a real face and real habits and real flaws you haven't discovered yet, would you still want what you've been saying you want? Not in theory, not in letters. In actual daily life, with all the parts that aren't in letters, with the difficulty and the frontier and the whole real impractical project of it, tell me the truth. M. Gideon read the letter 4 times, standing there on the main street of Harlan's Crossing, with the October wind starting to come in from the north, and Walt Briggs watching him through the post office window with the patient expression of a man who has learned to read a great deal into Gideon's responses to letters from Philadelphia. He thought about it carefully, not because he didn't know the answer, but because she deserved to receive the answer he'd actually thought about, and not just the one that was sitting right on the surface. Then he went home, sat at his table, wrote, "Yes, that's the whole answer, but you asked for truth, so I'll give you the rest of it too. I'm not an easy man to live with. I don't mean that as a warning to discourage you. I mean it as information because you deserve it. I work a lot, I think a lot, and don't always say what I'm thinking, which I'm aware is a flaw when the person you're living with needs to know what you're thinking. I get stubborn in a way that sometimes lasts longer than makes sense. When I'm worried about something, I get quiet in a way that can seem like coldness and isn't, but I understand how it lands. The frontier is not comfortable. It's also not temporary. I'm not building this towards some easier future somewhere else. This land is the plan. What we build here is the thing, not a step toward the thing. With all of that said, yes, I would still want it. I've been thinking about what it would actually be, the daily life version of us, and I don't think it scares me. Not in the way you're asking about. The only thing that has frightened me in this whole process is the possibility of it not happening. Come when you're ready. Tell me when, and I'll be at the station in Harlan's Crossing with Chester, who is a mule with a bad ear and a reliable temperament, and I will bring you home. G. She wrote back in 10 days. I'll be on the November 14th train from Philadelphia. It arrives in Harlan's Crossing on November 17th at 4 in the afternoon, assuming no delays, which I understand is optimistic, but I'm choosing optimism. Nell will be coming with me. I couldn't leave her with Clara yet. She's too young, and Clara is still settling. I hope that's acceptable. She is small and quiet and very smart, and she will probably want to tell you which bird a feather came from. I should tell you I'm frightened. I should also tell you I haven't been this sure about anything in years. M. Gideon read that letter 3 times. Then he went out and sat on the left chair and looked at the right one for a long while. Then he went to check on Rightness, who was fine, and to tell Chester about the plan, who responded with the considered indifference of a mule who has heard ambitious plans before. He had 32 days. He got to work. The house, when he walked through it with critical eyes and tried to see it the way a woman who had just spent her whole life in Philadelphia would see it, was functional and not much else. He was not embarrassed by it. It was what honest work had produced in a year and a half on a thin budget. But there were things that a person who cared about living in a space, as opposed to merely occupying it, would notice. The front room was dark in the mornings because the window faced south and the light came in at a low angle that made everything look slightly dingy. The kitchen had no real counter space to speak of, just the table and a narrow shelf he'd nailed up without thinking too hard about height, which was the wrong height for anyone of normal stature. The room he used as a bedroom had one small window and a floor that was clean but bare and cold underfoot. None of it was unfixable. Most of it was inexpensive to address if he was smart about what he prioritized. He added a second shelf in the kitchen at the right height and built a small counter surface from leftover lumber that fit between the stove and the far wall. He whitewashed the front room, which cost almost nothing and made a startling difference in how much light the space held. He cut a second window in the east wall of the bedroom and spent 3 days on it, including 1 full day of silent cursing when the frame didn't sit square the first time and he had to pull it and reset it. He sanded the bedroom floor and rubbed it with linseed oil, which didn't make it warm but made it look like someone had decided it mattered. He also, over the course of 2 weeks in late October, wrote her a letter describing what the ranch looked like in November. Not to prepare her or to soften anything. She'd been clear that she didn't want softening, but because he wanted her to have a picture. He described the way the light moved across the front room in the morning after he'd whitewashed the walls. He described Rightness and Chester and Ruth and what the barn smelled like, and how long it took to get to Harlan's Crossing by mule and what Harlan's Crossing actually looked like, which he described with accuracy and without romanticism. 12 buildings, a muddy main street, 300 residents, and one very good general store run by a woman named Helen Briggs, who was Walt's wife, and who had strong opinions about everything, and usually correct ones. He described the porch. He described the chairs. He described the view west from the porch at 4 in the afternoon in November, which was when the sun was doing the most with the light it had left. I want you to know what you're arriving at, he wrote. Not the version I wish it was. The actual version. Because what we build from here, that's the interesting part. That's the part I want to do with you. Her last letter before the trip was brief. She wrote, in the middle of packing, which was its own strange process. Deciding which pieces of a whole life traveled with you and which pieces you leave behind, and discovering that some of those decisions were harder than they should be about objects. I'm bringing my father's compositing stick, she wrote, the one he taught me to set type with. I know it won't be useful on a farm. I'm bringing it anyway. Nell has packed her feather box. Obviously, I've been trying to imagine what you sound like. The voice behind the letters. I have a version of it in my head, but I know it's probably wrong. I'm not sure if that's exciting or frightening. Probably both. 17 days. M. The night before the train was due, Gideon did not sleep much. This was not anxiety exactly, though there was some of that threading through the longer feeling, more like the particular alertness of someone who is standing at the exact edge of something they've been walking toward for a long time, and whose body has not yet caught up with the fact that the walking is nearly over. He lay in the dark in the bedroom with the new east window catching a thin slice of moonlight on the floor and thought about what it meant to be about to meet someone he already knew. That was the strange part. He wasn't meeting a stranger. He knew this woman, knew how she thought, knew what she cared about, knew what made her tired and what made her sharp. He knew her more honestly than he'd known most people he'd lived beside for years. But he didn't know her face or her voice or the way she moved through a room or what her silences sounded like in actual air. He was about to find out if the person he knew on paper and the person who stepped off a train in Harlan's Crossing were the same person or two different people who happened to share a name. He thought they'd be the same. He was fairly sure. But fairly sure was not the same thing as knowing. And he'd spent enough time on the frontier to understand that certainty was a condition you arrived at by going through the uncertain parts, not by avoiding them. He got up before dawn and made coffee and fed the animals in the cold dark and hitched Chester for the trip to town. He checked, for no reason he'd have admitted to a living soul, that both chairs on the porch were sitting level and clean. The night frost had put a thin white edge on everything, including the chairs, which he brushed off with his sleeve. The drive to Harlan's Crossing took the better part of 2 hours in the November cold. He arrived with time to spare, tied Chester at the post, and stood on the platform in front of the small station building with his hat in his hands, because it felt wrong to be wearing it at this particular moment in a way he couldn't explain. Helen Briggs, who was at the station picking up a supply delivery, looked at him standing there hatless in the cold and said, "You look like you're about to face a firing squad." "I'm fine," Gideon said. "You've got your hat in your hands, and you keep checking the tracks." "I'm fine." She nodded with the expression of a woman who knows when to stop pushing. "She coming today?" He looked at her. "Walt told me," she said simply. "Don't be annoyed with him. He's been more invested in this than he lets on. Half the town has, frankly. You're very bad at being private, Hartwell." He didn't have anything to say to that, so he looked back at the tracks. The train was 7 minutes late, which was 7 minutes longer than he'd have preferred. He heard it before he saw it, the sound coming in low and mechanical through the cold air, traveling across the flat prairie in a way that sound traveled out there, farther and clearer than it had any right to. Then the smoke first, a dark column against the pale November sky. Then the engine itself, coming in from the east big and loud and trailing steam that caught the cold and turned immediately to fog. The train slowed and stopped. The platform filled briefly with noise and motion. A few men unloading freight, a family with too much luggage, the conductor calling something in a voice designed to carry over machinery. And then the door of the second car opened. A woman came down the steps first, moving carefully with a bag over one shoulder and a small trunk she was managing one-handed because her other hand was occupied by a child. A small girl with dark hair and very serious eyes who was looking at everything on the platform at once with the concentrated expression of someone trying to take in a great deal very quickly. The woman looked up, scanned the platform, found him. She was not what he'd pictured, except in the ways that mattered. She was not especially tall. Her coat was gray and practical and slightly travel-worn. Her hair was dark and somewhat wind-blown from the journey. She had a compositing stick tucked impractically into the outside pocket of her bag, the way you'd carry something you'd grabbed at the last second and hadn't properly stowed. She looked at him across the platform for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last. Then she said, loud enough to carry through the noise, "You're shorter than I pictured." He laughed. He couldn't help it. It came out of him completely unguarded in a way that he would think about later as the moment he understood that everything was going to be all right. Not easy, not perfect, but all right in the truest sense of the word. "You're exactly what I pictured," he said. She walked across the platform toward him, pulling the small girl, Nell, gently behind her. Up close she was tired, clearly, from 3 days on a train. There were shadows under her eyes, and her coat had a small stain on the left cuff that was probably ink, which he found he couldn't have explained, but that felt exactly right. She stopped about 3 feet away and looked at him steadily with the expression of someone conducting a rapid and thorough assessment. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "This is Nell." She nudged the girl forward slightly. "Nell, this is Mr. Hartwell." Nell looked up at him with complete seriousness. Do you have birds on your property? Some, Gideon said. Meadowlarks, mostly. A few red-tailed hawks. I found a burrowing owl last spring that had set up in the south pasture. Nell's eyes sharpened. A burrowing owl? Yes. Is it still there? Last I checked. She looked at her sister. He has a burrowing owl. Margaret Ellison looked at Gideon Hartwell in the cold November air, on the platform of a small Kansas train station with the steam from the engine still drifting around them both. And something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly. More like the specific relaxation of a tension she'd been carrying for longer than she'd known. The settling of something that had been braced. All right, she said quietly. Just that. But the way she said it had weight to it. The kind of weight that meant more than the word. Chester was waiting at the post, patient as always, his bad ear canted at its characteristic angle. That's Chester, Gideon said as they approached. You described him accurately, Margaret said, studying the mule. He does look philosophical. He has his moments. She reached out and let Chester nose at her hand, which Chester did with his usual dignified indifference. Nell immediately began asking about the ear. Gideon loaded the trunk, helped Nell up first, then offered his hand to Margaret, who took it, the first time they touched, with the matter-of-fact directness she apparently brought to everything, her grip firm and real and present. They drove west out of Harlan's Crossing into the open prairie, the three of them on the seat with Chester pulling steady ahead. The sky was enormous and pale, and the grass was winter brown in every direction, and the light was doing what November light did in the late afternoon, lying long and cold and somehow beautiful across everything. After a while, Nell fell asleep against Margaret's shoulder, the feather box on her lap. Margaret was quiet for a long stretch. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind that was thinking. Then she said, not looking at him, looking out at the prairie, "It's bigger than I expected. The sky or the land?" She considered. Both. Together. The way they're the same thing out here. He nodded. That was exactly right, and he'd never quite put it that way. Is it always this quiet? She asked. Mostly. Wind in summer. Ice in winter. It's not quiet so much as it's empty of certain kinds of noise. You get used to the other kinds. She looked at the grass moving in the distance, a slow, rolling shift like something breathing underneath it. I think I could, she said. Get used to it. It was not a declaration. It was an honest assessment of a thing she hadn't fully determined yet, offered to him plainly because that was how she did things, and he understood it as exactly that. The porch is west-facing, he said. You'll see the sun go down over the grass. I don't have good language for it. You'll see. She nodded, said nothing more for a while. The prairie opened ahead of them, flat and honest and enormous, the same ground he'd been working alone for a year and a half, that was now, in some way he could feel but not yet name, a different ground than it had been that morning. Chester plodded on with the steady patience of the reliably unsentimental. The second chair was waiting. The first morning was awkward. There was no avoiding it. Gideon had given Margaret and Nell the bedroom, the one with the new east window and the linseed-oiled floor, and had slept on a bedroll in the front room with the stove banked down to coals and Chester's occasional commentary drifting from the barn. He woke at his usual hour, before full light, and lay there for a moment with the specific strangeness of knowing there were other people breathing in the same structure. It had been a long time since that was true. The house felt different already. Not better or worse yet, just different in a way that required adjustment. He got up quietly and built the fire in the kitchen stove and put water on for coffee and went out to do the morning feeding before anyone else was awake, mostly because the animals needed it, and partly because he wanted to give Margaret and Nell the space to wake up in a place that was entirely new to them without him standing in it, watching to see how they felt about it. He was in the barn with Ruth when he heard the back door of the house open and close. Margaret came around the side of the barn in her coat over what was clearly a dress she'd slept in, her hair not yet properly arranged, holding 2 cups of coffee that she'd apparently located and made without his help, which told him she'd been paying attention to where things were the night before. She held 1 cup out to him without ceremony. "Thank you," he said. "I found the coffee tin," she said. "I hope I used the right amount." He tasted it. It was slightly stronger than he made his own, but not unreasonably so. "It's good." She looked around the barn. At Ruth, at Rightness standing in the corner regarding her with the philosophical calm that seemed to be a trait Gideon had not been entirely wrong about, at the organized disorder of tools and harness and feed sacks that made up the interior. She was doing that assessment thing he'd noticed on the platform, taking in the space quickly and specifically, cataloging. "You keep it cleaner than I expected," she said. "Were you expecting chaos?" "I wasn't sure what I was expecting," she said honestly. She leaned against the doorframe with her coffee. "This is Rightness?" "That one. The smaller one." Margaret studied the young cow. "She does have a certain quality to her." "I thought so." They drank their coffee in the barn in the early light with the cold coming in thin and clean, and neither of them talking for a while, which was fine. Not uncomfortable fine. Actually fine. He noticed it with some relief. The silences in letters were easy. You never knew if the actual in-person silences would hold the same quality or collapse into something anxious. These ones held. Nell appeared at the barn door 10 minutes later in her coat and boots over her nightgown, the feather box under her arm, her hair in a state that suggested she'd slept on it hard. She looked at Gideon with her characteristically direct gaze. "Where is the burrowing owl?" she said. Not a question, a statement of intent. "South pasture," he said. "But it's early. She might not be out yet." "I'll wait," Nell said, with the patient certainty of a 9-year-old who has decided something. Margaret met Gideon's eyes over the rim of her cup with an expression that said clearly, "This is what I brought with me. I warned you." He felt the corner of his mouth pull up. "I'll show you after breakfast," he said to Nell. "Deal?" Nell considered whether this was acceptable. "Deal," she said. That was the first morning. The days that followed had a shape that was neither easy nor impossible. They were the days of two people who know each other well in one medium trying to learn each other in another, which is its own particular kind of work. Some things translated directly. Margaret's directness, which had come through every letter, was exactly as direct in person. No softening, no performance, just the clean line of what she actually thought. Her humor was drier than he'd heard it in print and landed faster, which required him to be paying attention. Her opinions about how things should be organized were specific and confident and occasionally at odds with how he'd been doing things, and she expressed them without apology, which he'd told her he preferred, and which he found he actually did prefer, even when it was inconvenient. Other things surprised him. She was quieter in the mornings than he'd expected, not unfriendly, just internally occupied in a way that he recognized as thinking, the working through things quality that had produced those careful, precise letters. She needed the first hour of daylight to fully arrive in herself, and once he understood that, he stopped reading her early morning quiet as something directed at him. She was also better with the physical work than he'd assumed, not because he'd thought she couldn't manage it, but because the specific competence of someone who has run a business, the capacity to look at a problem and immediately begin sorting it into what's urgent and what's not, turned out to be directly applicable to a ranch in ways that weren't obvious from the outside. The first time he saw it clearly was in the second week, when the well pump started giving trouble. He came in from the north field at midday and found Margaret at the well, with the pump head disassembled on the ground beside her in a way that suggested she'd been at it for at least an hour. She had grease on her hands and a frustrated expression that was doing battle with a focused one. "What happened?" he said. "The leather seal is worn through," she said without looking up. "It was losing pressure on every third stroke. I took it apart to see what the problem was." He crouched beside her and looked at the parts laid out with a precision that suggested she'd been paying attention to their arrangement. "You've done this before?" "No," she said. "But I've set type, which requires the same principle. Understanding how the pieces fit relative to each other before you can fix the one that's wrong." She looked up at him. "Do you have a replacement seal?" "In the barn. I'll get it. I'll finish putting it back, if you tell me which part goes where." They worked on it together, him explaining and her listening with the sharp attention of someone who only needs to be told once. 30 minutes later, the pump was reassembled and working, and she pumped the handle 3 times to confirm pressure and stood up and wiped her hands on a rag with the satisfied expression of a problem concluded. "Good," she said simply. He looked at her. "Most people who come out here from the city find the physical parts hard." She gave him a level look. "I ran a print shop for 2 years. That involves machinery, heavy equipment, and problems that need solving on a deadline with no time for squeamishness. The frontier is different in the specifics, not in the principle. He nodded, said, "Fair enough." She turned to go back inside, then stopped, turned back. "You're surprised," she said, not accusatory, just observing. "A little. You wrote in your letters that you didn't want to take care of someone," she said, "that you wanted a partner. I believed you. I'm trying to be the thing you said you wanted." "I know," he said. "I can see that." Something passed between them then that wasn't quite a smile from either of them, more like the mutual recognition of something settling into place. "The pump pressure is good now," she said, and went inside. The proposal, when it happened, was not what either of them had probably imagined. They'd been there 3 weeks, long enough for Nell to locate the burrowing owl, name it Socrates, and establish a daily monitoring relationship that the owl appeared to tolerate with surprising patience. Long enough for Gideon and Margaret to have their first real argument, which was about the North Field planting schedule, and lasted 1 full evening and involved some specific heat from both sides before arriving at a compromise that was, they both privately acknowledged, better than either of their original positions. Long enough for the arrangement of the household to have settled into something functional, not perfectly organized, still slightly awkward around the edges, but functional in the way of 2 competent people who have decided to make something work. It was a Sunday evening. Nell was asleep. The dishes from supper were done. Margaret was at the table with the lamp going over a ledger she'd started keeping of the ranch's accounts. She'd looked at his accounting system in the first week, said nothing critical about it in words, and then quietly begun building something more organized alongside it, which he'd watched with the particular appreciation of someone who knows a problem is being solved and is wise enough not to interrupt the solving. Gideon was on the porch. It was cold, but not brutally so. The kind of December cold that was honest without being cruel, the stars clear and enormous overhead. He was sitting in the left chair, which had become his chair so definitively by now that it would have felt wrong to sit in the other one. The right one was beside him, empty. He heard the door open behind him. Margaret came out with her coat pulled around her, holding her own coffee. She'd developed a habit of 1 cup in the evening, which was different from him. He was done by noon. And she stood at the edge of the porch for a moment looking at the sky the way she sometimes did, taking inventory of the dark. Then she sat in the right chair. It was the first time she'd sat in it. In 3 weeks she'd come out to the porch in the evenings occasionally, but she'd always leaned against the rail or stood. She'd sat in his chair once by accident, realized it, and moved without comment, but she'd never sat in the right one. She sat in it now. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Gideon said, "That's the chair." "I know," she said. You've been avoiding it." She thought about that. "I suppose I didn't want to sit in it until I decided to sit in it," she said, "if that makes sense." "It makes sense." She looked out at the prairie, the dark grass under the dark sky, the horizon invisible but felt, that particular sensation of the plains at night where you know the land extends past seen in every direction. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether this is something I'm doing because I had nowhere else to go or because I actually want it." She said it plainly, not as a criticism but as an honest accounting of a thing she'd been working through. "My father died. The shop is gone. The city has nothing left for me that it wouldn't have had anyway. I need to make sure I'm here because I want to be here, not because it was the available door." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What did you decide?" She was quiet for a moment. "I decide a little more every day," she said. "The pump seal, the ledger, the way the light comes in the east window in the morning, Nell and that ridiculous owl." She paused. "You." "Me. The way you said fair enough when I explained about the print shop, like you actually heard me and adjusted what you thought." She looked at him directly. "Most people don't do that. They hear something new and they wait for it to finish before going back to what they already thought." "You do the same thing," he said. "I know. I noticed." The cold was coming down, but neither of them moved inside. The stars were doing what stars did out here, which was be present in a way that city stars didn't manage. Gideon looked at the empty cup he was holding. He'd finished his coffee 10 minutes ago, and then set it down on the porch floor beside the chair. He thought about how to say what he was going to say, and then decided the way he'd always decided things in letters, and had decided things about Margaret specifically, directly. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "Not because of the arrangement, and not because you're here, and not because it's the practical next step. Because of the pump seal, and the ledger, and the way you talk about your father and about your sister Nell. Because of everything in the letters, and because of 3 weeks of actually knowing you. Because when I think about the next 30 years of work on this ground, the version with you in it is the one I want." She didn't answer immediately. He'd expected that. She was not a woman who gave quick answers to things that deserved slow ones. After a while, she said, "You understand what you're asking." "I believe so. I have opinions. I have opinions about almost everything, and I don't keep them quiet, and sometimes I'm wrong, but it takes me longer than it should to accept that I'm wrong, which you've already seen. Yes, I'm going to want to do things my way sometimes, and your way won't make obvious sense to me, and I won't always be gracious about saying so. I know. I've read your letters." She made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "This is a hard life," she said. It wasn't a complaint, just a fact she was naming. "Yes. I knew that coming in," she said. "I'm not saying it because I'm surprised." "I know." She was quiet again. He waited. The wind came through from the north, gentle enough, moving the dried grass in the dark. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that too." He nodded. She nodded. Neither of them made any dramatic movement about it, which was right for who they both were. She reached over and briefly put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, not holding it, just setting it there for a moment, warm and real against the cold. Then she took it back and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Your accounting system before I fixed it was genuinely alarming," she said. "I know. How are you making decisions without knowing your actual margins?" "Instinct, mostly." "That is not a system." "It's worked so far." "You've been lucky," she said. "We're going to have an actual system." "Yes," he said without argument, because he could see already that she was right, and that arguing about it would be a waste of time that was better spent on the actual system. They sat on the porch in the cold for another half hour, talking about practical things, the spring planting, the cattle situation, what to do about the barn wall that was starting to show weakness again on the south side. Ordinary conversation, problem-solving conversation. The kind of conversation you have with a person you're going to share a working life with, which is different from the kind you have with someone you're trying to impress, and in some ways harder, and in some ways considerably more real. They married in December at the Harlan's Crossing Church, with Walt and Helen Briggs as witnesses, and Nell as the only other attendee, in a ceremony that lasted 22 minutes and concluded with Helen crying quietly and Nell recording the date in the small notebook she'd started keeping alongside her feather records. Hank Krause heard about it the next morning and rode over to offer congratulations with the expression of a man who had underestimated something and was doing the arithmetic on what that meant. "2 chairs, he said, standing in the yard. "2 chairs, Gideon confirmed. Hank looked at Margaret, who was at the well with her coat on and her sleeves rolled back, working with a focused efficiency that was already becoming characteristic. "She seems capable," Hank said, in a tone that was intended as a compliment. "More capable than me in several respects," Gideon said. "Don't tell her I said that. She'll expect me to admit it directly." Hank rode home slightly baffled, which was becoming his default state in relation to Gideon Hartwell. The winter was not kind. January brought a cold that was different in character from December's. Serious cold, the kind that gets into the structure of things and finds every gap you thought you'd sealed. The Northfield fence took damage from ground heave that required a week of repair and temperatures that made the work slow and painful. 2 of the chickens Margaret had brought from a family in Harlan's Crossing, her first independent acquisition for the ranch, a flock of 6, didn't survive a particularly brutal overnight freeze despite the extra insulation she'd added to their small enclosure. She was more upset about this than she showed, which he could tell from the particular set of her jaw the next morning, the way she tallied the loss in her ledger with the stroke of the pen that had more pressure in it than the motion required. "Not your fault," he said. "I should have put more straw," she said. "Even with more straw, that temperature—" "Don't," she said, quietly. Not angry, just not ready for the reasonable explanation yet. He said nothing, made coffee, left a cup where she could reach it. She picked it up without comment, went back to her ledger. 20 minutes later, she said without looking up, "The remaining 4 are fine. I checked twice this morning." "Good," he said. I'm ordering 12 more from the Hendersons next month when the weather breaks. If we're going to have eggs worth having, we need a proper flock. Okay. I'm putting it in the accounts. Okay. She did look up then, just briefly. Something in her face that was not quite an apology but was adjacent to it, the recognition that she'd been sharp earlier. He met it with a small nod, which was his way of saying, I know, and it's fine, and she received that and went back to work. That was how they fought. Not always cleanly, not always quickly, but with the underlying commitment of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and were not willing to let the choosing unravel over chickens, however cold the winter that had killed them. The winter gave them another test in February, a bigger one. Gideon's right hand, he'd been favoring it since December without fully acknowledging why, got worse. A deep ache in the base of the thumb that spread across the palm when the temperature dropped, an old injury from his first winter on the homestead that he'd managed by ignoring it. In February, it stopped responding to ignoring. He said nothing for 4 days, during which Margaret noticed something was wrong on day 2 and waited him out until day 4, when he dropped a full bucket of water in the barn because his grip failed and stood there looking at it with the expression of a man who has run out of ways to pretend something isn't happening. She was beside him. How long? She said. Since December. Gideon. It wasn't this bad in December. She picked up the bucket. Sit down, she said, in the tone she used when she was done negotiating. He sat on the hay bale. She looked at his hand, held it in both of hers in the cold barn, with the matter-of-fact care of someone who has decided that tenderness and practicality are not different things, and pressed carefully in different places until she found where the problem lived. He held still even when it wasn't comfortable. You need to see a doctor, she said. The nearest one is in Abilene. I know where the nearest one is. That's 2 days. Yes, she said. 2 days. And you need to go. I can't take 2 days off in February. I'll manage the ranch, she said. Nell can help with the feeding. The Harlan's Crossing operations we can defer 3 days without damage. I have already looked at the schedule. He looked at her. She had already looked at the schedule. Of course she had. You planned this conversation, he said. I've been waiting for you to tell me about your hand since Tuesday, she said. I've had time to plan. He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know she was right, but because accepting help was not something he'd had much practice with in the 1.5 years before she arrived, and the practice hadn't fully overridden the instinct yet. It's not that bad, he said, knowing as he said it that it was a losing argument. She gave him the look she deployed when she was being patient with something she found genuinely frustrating. Gideon, your hand controls most of what you do on this ranch. If you lose function in it because you were too stubborn to spend 2 days seeing a doctor, that's not stoic, that's just stupid. That's a fair point, he said. Thank you. I hate that it's a fair point. I know, she said, and she almost smiled. You'll go Monday. I've already asked Helen Briggs if she knows anyone who could ride with you the first day, so you're not out on the road alone in case it gets worse. You asked Helen. On Thursday, yes. He sat there in the cold barn with the cow breathing nearby and his wife holding his bad hand and felt something that he didn't have a word for, exactly. The specific vulnerability of being known well enough that someone could anticipate your stubbornness and plan around it while still treating you like a person capable of making the right decision if given the facts. You're formidable, he said. Yes, she said simply. I know. Go Monday. He went Monday. The doctor in Abilene told him it was tendon damage from the original injury that had been made worse by cold and overuse, gave him a splint and strict instructions, and charged him $4, which was $4 he didn't love spending, but which Margaret had already allocated in the accounts under a category she'd labeled simply necessary. When he came back on Wednesday afternoon, she was in the kitchen with the lamp going and the ledger open and Nell asleep at the other end of the table with a feather and a small drawing of Socrates the owl she'd been working on before she'd succumbed. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the beef stew she'd had going most of the day. He stood in the door for a moment. She looked up, took in the splint. What did he say? Tendons. Rest it for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she said, and he could see her already recalculating what that meant for the spring work schedule, running numbers in her head. I can still do most things, he said. Not full grip work for 6 weeks, she said. Not a question. No, She nodded, made a note in the ledger. Okay, she said. We'll redistribute. Sit down. Dinner's ready. He sat. She ladled the stew. Nell woke up and blinked at him and said without much preamble, Socrates was out this morning. She caught something. I think it was a vole. Good for Socrates, Gideon said. I drew her, Nell said, showing him the drawing, which was actually quite precise for a 9-year-old. That's good, he said, and meant it. Margaret set his bowl down in front of him and sat across the table, and they ate together in the lamplight in the cold February evening, with the wind doing its regular business outside, and the stove ticking with heat, and Nell describing the owl's hunting technique in more detail than the situation probably required. It was ordinary, completely, entirely ordinary. He'd been trying to build something worth having for a year and a half alone on this ground, and here was what it actually felt like to have it. Not the large moments, not the dramatic ones, but this specific ordinary evening, the stew and the lamp and the child drawing owls at the table and the woman across from him with ink on her finger from the ledger, already looking at the week ahead. He thought about the letters, all those months of paper and distance, all those carefully honest words crossing 1,000 miles of prairie and winter between them. He thought he was building towards something in those months. He was right, but he hadn't fully known what the thing was. He'd thought it was the marriage, the beginning. He understood now that the letters had been trying to tell him what the actual thing was. Not the beginning, but this. The exact quality of this ordinary evening in a kitchen on the Kansas frontier in February, where nothing spectacular was happening and everything that mattered was present. He ate his stew, asked Nell a question about the vole, listened to the wind. Margaret's eyes met his across the table once, briefly, over Nell's continued description of owl behavior. She raised her eyebrows slightly in the expression she had that meant, this child. I love her. She is a great deal. He held up his good hand in a small gesture that meant, I know, so do I. Outside, the Kansas winter pressed against the windows and found them sealed. Spring came late in 1881 and was worth the wait. The ground thawed in April with the particular stubbornness of ground that had been frozen deep, giving up its cold in layers over 3 weeks before it was workable. Gideon's hand had healed through the winter. Not completely. There was a stiffness in the mornings that he'd probably carry the rest of his life, but functional, which was what the ranch required. The 6 weeks of restricted work had cost them in some ways and cost them in others that were harder to quantify. The enforced stillness had pushed him to think instead of do, which was not his natural mode, but which produced, by March, a set of ideas about the Northfield rotation that he and Margaret spent 2 evenings arguing over and arrived at something better than either starting position, which had become their characteristic method. Margaret's ledger system had, by spring, transformed what he knew about his own operation. Numbers he'd been estimating by feel for a year and a half were now actual numbers, and some of them were better than he'd thought, and some were worse, and all of them were useful. She'd also caught 2 places where he'd been losing money in small, consistent amounts that added up. The feed purchasing schedule, which he'd been doing reactively instead of forward, and the cattle selling timing, which with a slight adjustment to when in the season he brought animals to market could reliably improve margins. How did you know to look for that? He asked her one evening when she'd spread the pages out and shown him the pattern. My father's shop ran on timing, she said. Everything in printing is about when the paper arrives, when the ink is ready, when the order needs to ship. If the timing is wrong, the whole thing costs more than it should. Same principle. He looked at the numbers. That's 3 years of selling wrong. 2.5, she said. Don't catastrophize. I'm not catastrophizing. I'm doing arithmetic. Do different arithmetic, she said. Calculate what the next 10 years look like with the right timing. She tapped the page. That number's better. He looked at it. It was considerably better. All right, he said. I know, she said, without particular triumph, which he appreciated. They planted the Northfield in May with an expanded wheat variety that a university extension pamphlet Margaret had written away for in February had recommended for the Kansas climate. This was the first of what would become a pattern, Margaret finding information, digesting it, presenting it as a practical option rather than a directive, and then both of them deciding. It worked because she understood the difference between knowing something was a good idea and unilaterally implementing it, and because he was willing to be persuaded by evidence rather than ego most of the time. Most of the time. The drought came in the summer of 1882 without warning, which was how droughts came on the prairie, not as a gradual tightening, but as an absence, a simply not raining that went on past the point where you stopped hoping it would stop and started calculating what it meant. By July, the kitchen garden was struggling. By August, the wheat in the north field was 2 weeks from failure. Gideon stood at the edge of the north field on a Wednesday morning in August and looked at the wheat and felt the specific cold weight of watching something you've invested in die and being unable to stop it. Margaret came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything immediately, which meant she was also looking and also calculating. "The south field," she said after a while. "What about it? If we pull the irrigation from the kitchen garden and redirect, we'd lose the garden." "We'd lose the garden and save the wheat," she said. "The garden feeds us this winter. The wheat feeds us the next 3 years." He looked at the field, looked at the sky, which was a flat, relentless blue with nothing useful in it. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it out loud so we're deciding it together instead of you standing here feeling bad about it alone." He turned his head to look at her. She was watching the field with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she was right, which was not the same as it being easy. "The tomatoes are done anyway," she said. "The squash may be another 2 weeks. The beans are past." "I know." "So we're really losing the late greens and the root vegetables we were planning for winter storage. And the kitchen garden infrastructure. It'll need to be rebuilt next spring." "I know," she said. "I've put it in the accounts." He almost said, "Of course you have," but it came out instead as something that was half a laugh and half something else. And she heard the difference and looked at him. And for a moment they just stood there in the August heat, with the failing wheat and the cloudless sky, and the particular weight of what was going to be a hard year ahead of them. "We'll be all right," she said, not brightly, just factually. "Yeah," he said, "we'll be tight, but we'll be all right." "I know." "Stop saying I know and say something useful," she said. "Redirect the irrigation," he said. "I'll start this afternoon." "Thank you," she said, and walked back toward the house. The wheat survived. Barely. The yield was 60% of what they'd projected, which was 60% more than nothing, and enough, with careful management, to see them through. The kitchen garden was gone. The root cellar they'd been planning to stock was stocked instead with what Margaret had managed to preserve from the garden before they'd shut down the irrigation, plus dried beans and smoked beef, and the flour from last year's reserve that she'd been stretching with the careful arithmetic of someone who does not panic but does not underestimate either. The winter of 1882 was the first winter that felt genuinely precarious. Not desperate. They never crossed into desperate, but close enough to it that the margin felt thin in a way that required daily attention. Margaret tracked every pound of flour, every jar of preserved food, every cord of wood against a projection she'd made in October of what they'd need to reach April. She updated it weekly with the quiet focus of someone who finds that managing a problem carefully is preferable to being surprised by it. Gideon watched her do this and understood something he hadn't fully articulated before. That what she brought to the ranch was not just organization or intelligence, but a particular kind of nerve. The ability to look at a hard situation clearly without flinching away from the numbers and still function. Still make dinner. Still sit on the porch in the brief warm windows of winter afternoon and say something dry and funny about Chester's ongoing relationship with the barn door. They had their second serious fight that winter in January over something that started as a disagreement about feed rationing for the cattle and became, in the way of fights between people who are actually fighting about something else, a fight about something else. He'd come in from the barn and told her he was thinking of selling Ruth. She'd looked up from the ledger. "Ruth is your best producer." "Ruth is old," he said. The hay situation is manageable until March," she said. "I've run the numbers 3 times." "I know, but if you sell her now, you get less for her than in spring, lose a full season of milk production, and replace her with what?" She closed the ledger. "This isn't about Ruth." "It's about the feed," he said. You've been outside for 3 hours in 12-degree weather, and you came in looking like that, she said, gesturing at his face in a way that suggested that was a specific expression she recognized. What happened? He was quiet. Gideon? The fence line on the east pasture is worse than I thought, he said. If it fails in a hard wind, we lose that pasture and have to hold the cattle in the barn through March, which means the hay situation is not manageable. She looked at him. How bad? 2 sections need to be replaced, not repaired. I can't do it alone in this weather, and I didn't want to... He stopped. Didn't want to tell me, she said. Didn't want to worry you, he said. It's different. It is not different, she said, and there was an edge in it that wasn't anger exactly, but was close to it. We don't manage information away from each other. That was the agreement. I was going to tell you tonight. You were going to figure out a solution first and then tell me. He said nothing, because she was right. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the yard and the fence line in the distance. He watched her process it, the slight movement of her jaw, the way she stood with her weight balanced when she was thinking hard. Then she turned back. Call Hank Kraus, she said. He owes you 3 days from the harvest exchange. You do the east fence next week before the next cold system. I will manage the hay numbers with the fence situation accounted for. You can manage that? Yes, she said flatly. Because you told me, which is why you should have told me 2 days ago when you first saw the fence. He took that. You're right. I know I am. She picked up the ledger. Don't sell Ruth. Okay. And next time, I know, he said. I'll tell you. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as the one that came after the fight, was finished but before the air had fully cleared. I'm not trying to be involved in everything, she said quieter. I'm trying to make sure we're not blindsided by the things we could have seen coming. That's different. I understand the difference, he said. I'm still getting used to having someone who can see things with me. She looked at him for a moment. The edge came out of her face. Get used to it faster, she said, but not harshly. Hank Kraus came Thursday. The fence was replaced in 2 brutal days. The hay held through March. Ruth lived to see another spring and produced, as Margaret had projected, a full season of milk, and eventually a calf they sold at a price considerably better than the winter crisis price Ruth herself would have fetched. The spring of 1883 brought the community library. It started because of Nell, which was fitting. Nell was 11 now, serious and specific as ever, and had been working her way through Gideon's small collection of books with the methodical attention she brought to Feathers, one at a time, completely, then moved on. When she finished the 3rd one, she looked at the empty shelf space where more books should have been and said to Margaret, There aren't enough books in Harlan's Crossing. No, Margaret agreed. Why not? Because nobody's brought them yet. Nell thought about this. We should bring them. Margaret looked at her sister, who was 11 and had a point. She mentioned it to Gideon that evening. He looked at her the way he looked at things he could see the shape of before she'd finished explaining. You want to start a library? He said. I want to start a lending collection, she said. Small, whatever we can gather. A few shelves in the back of the general store, maybe. Helen Briggs has space, and she's always saying the town needs more of something, though she's usually talking about practical goods. Helen would say yes, he said. I know she would. You've already talked to Helen. I mentioned the idea. He shook his head, but the way he shook his head when he was not actually opposed. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, she said. Maybe lumber for shelves eventually? And your opinion on whether this is a terrible use of time we don't entirely have. He thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought, which she watched him do. The slight focus that came over his face when he wasn't just agreeing. We don't have easy time, he said. But I don't think it's terrible. The settlement's been growing. The Kowalski family came in last fall. The Pemberton boy is 15 and supposedly smart, but there's nothing for him to do with that except leave. Things that give people a reason to stay, they matter. She looked at him. That's a more sophisticated argument than I expected on a Tuesday evening. I have depths, he said. You do, she said, in a tone that was fond without being soft. The lending collection started with 43 books, her father's compositing manual, the Ohio agricultural essays, the English novel Gideon had read during the blizzard, whatever she could gather from families in Harlan's Crossing who had books they'd brought west and might be willing to share. Helen Briggs gave over a corner of the general store and built 2 shelves herself out of leftover crating lumber. Margaret made a borrowing ledger with the same precision she brought to everything, and within 2 months had it running with 41 active borrowers out of a settlement that had, at last count, 83 adults. That's almost exactly 50%, Gideon said, looking at the numbers. 50.6, Margaret said. I'm working on the other 49.4. Word spread the way things spread in frontier settlements. Slowly, then all at once. A family 20 miles east sent 3 books and a letter asking if they could borrow. Margaret said yes and worked out a system for sending books by whoever was making the trip between settlements anyway. By the end of 1883, the lending collection was, by any reasonable measure, a small regional library operating out of a corner of a general store in a Kansas town of 300 people and serving a radius of 30 miles. Helen Briggs told anyone who'd listen that it was Margaret Hartwell's doing. Margaret told them it was Helen's Corner and Nell's idea, and her father's compositing manual that started it. Gideon said nothing in public because it was not his accomplishment to take credit for. But in private, he looked at what she'd built from 43 books and a lending ledger and felt something that was specific and warm and had no better word than pride, which was not a word he used loosely. Their son was born in the fall of 1883. They named him Edwin, for her father. The birth was hard, not catastrophically, but hard enough. 31 hours. A midwife from Harlan's Crossing named Louise Adler, who had seen more difficult and said so calmly, and a November storm that arrived at the worst possible time and made the longest hours feel longer. Gideon spent those hours in the front room with his back against the wall doing a kind of internal accounting he'd never done before, counting what mattered, what he was willing to negotiate with the world about, and what he was not, arriving at the unsurprising conclusion that the woman in the other room was not in the negotiable category. When Louise came out and said, "Mother and baby, both fine," he sat there for a moment and did not move because his legs were not available to him yet. Then he went in. Margaret was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired into something cellular, the complete depletion of a body that had done the hardest work it knew how to do. Edwin was small and red and extraordinarily loud for his size, and was in the crook of her arm with the focused expression of someone who has strong opinions about his current situation. She looked up at Gideon. Her hair was damp. Her eyes were clearer than they had any right to be given the last 31 hours. "He has your jaw," she said. "He has your volume," Gideon said. She made a sound that was too tired to be a laugh, but was in the same family. He pulled the chair close and sat beside her and looked at his son, who was, in fact, very loud, and who was, in fact, the most specific and real thing he'd ever been confronted with. "Edwin?" he said, trying the name. "Edwin," she agreed. The baby expressed a strong opinion about something. Neither of them could tell what. "He's going to be exhausting," Margaret said. "Probably." "I'm happy about it." "So am I," he said. Outside, the November storm moved on. The way storms moved on the prairie, decisively, without ceremony, as if it had places to be. The morning after was clear and cold, and the light came in the east window onto the floor in the long rectangle that had become, over 3 years, one of the things he associated with the word home, that specific quality of morning light in that specific room, changing with the seasons but always present, always landing in the same place. Edwin Hartwell grew up in that light. He grew up in the house his father had built before it had a roof, on the land his father had broken with a borrowed plow horse, with a mother who kept the accounts and ran a library and had opinions about everything, and a father who worked the ground with a stubbornness that was, his mother occasionally noted, only sometimes a virtue. He grew up with Nell coming to visit every summer from the teaching position she'd eventually taken at a school in a settlement 40 miles north, bringing feathers and books, and her very specific observations about the natural world that Edwin inherited wholesale. He grew up with 2 chairs on the porch. He understood, from an early age, without being explicitly told, that the 2 chairs were not just furniture. He understood it the way children understand things that are important to the adults around them, not through explanation, but through the quality of attention those adults bring to something. He saw the way his father always sat in the left one. He saw the way his mother sat in the right one in the evenings when the day's work was done. He saw, on the rare occasion when they sat out there together and he was supposed to be asleep but was watching from the window, the particular quality of silence between them. Not empty silence, but full silence, the kind that belongs to people who have said everything they needed to say and are now just sitting inside a life they built together. He asked once, when he was 7, "Why do you always sit in the same chairs?" His father said, "Habit." His mother said, "Because some things you keep where they are once you've found them." He was 7, so he thought about this for a while and then went to find something else to do. But he didn't forget it, the way children don't forget the things adults say when they're not performing for them. The years move the way years move when work gives them structure. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular rhythm of seasons that keep arriving on schedule, regardless of whether you're ready for them. More children eventually. More land, acquired carefully over time. The library outgrew Helen Briggs's corner, and Margaret fundraised, with the methodical determination she brought to everything she decided was necessary, for a small dedicated building on the main street of Harlan's Crossing, which opened in 1889 and which the town named, over her objection, the Hartwell Reading Room. "They should name it for Helen," she said, "or for my father." "They named it for you," Gideon said. "Accept it." "It's uncomfortable." "Most true things are," he said. She looked at him. "That's irritatingly correct." "I know," he said, in the tone he used specifically when he was being deliberately infuriating, which was one of the tools in the particular vocabulary of two people who have been married long enough to know exactly how to get under each other's skin and have mostly decided not to, but keep the option available. She shook her head, did not smile, but her eyes did. The droughts came again. The hard winters came. A cattle disease moved through the region in the late 1880s and took 11 of their animals before they understood what they were dealing with and could stop the spread, and that loss was real and significant and set them back 2 years of careful progress. They recovered. They always recovered, not because recovery was easy, but because the alternative was unacceptable, and neither of them was built for unacceptable. The community around them grew. The Kowalski family put down roots, and their son married one of the Krause daughters. The Pemberton boy, who turned out to be as smart as advertised, left, as Gideon had predicted, but came back years later with an agricultural degree from a state college and ideas about irrigation that he and Gideon spent 3 years implementing on a cooperative basis with 4 neighboring farms, which increased yield across all 4 operations in a way that none of them could have managed alone. There were people in Harlan's Crossing who'd grown up knowing the Hartwells, not meeting them, but knowing them the way you know the fixed points in a landscape: the ranch, the library, the 2 chairs on the porch, the woman who kept the accounts and would tell you plainly what she thought about your crop rotation, the man who would help you fix a fence in February if you asked, and sometimes, if you didn't. They were not mythologized, which is how they would have wanted it. They were just present. Consistently, stubbornly, usefully present, for year after year after year, in the particular way of people who decided where they were and stayed there and worked at it until the work became the place and the place became the life. And the life became something that held other lives up around it. The way good ground holds roots. The porch held. The chairs held. The prairie stretched west every evening in the long light, and they watched it together, the way they'd been watching it since the November afternoon he'd driven her home from the Harlan's Crossing station with Chester at his unhurried pace and the sky enormous overhead. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the losses that accumulate in any life long enough to be worth calling a life, but together, which had been the original proposition, and which turned out to be the one that mattered. Gideon Hartwell died on a Tuesday in October of 1912, which was the kind of detail that stuck in Margaret's memory. Not because the day of the week mattered, but because Tuesday was his least favorite day. He'd said so once, years ago, and she'd asked why, and he'd said he couldn't explain it. Tuesdays just always felt like they were trying too hard to be Monday and not quite managing it. And she'd told him that was the most irrational opinion she'd ever heard him express, and he'd said probably, and that had been the end of it. She thought about that conversation at his bedside that morning, which was the kind of thing grief did, pulled up the small, ridiculous things and held them up next to the large ones until you couldn't tell the difference between them anymore. He was 62 years old. The heart, the doctor said, which was not a surprise exactly. He'd had 2 smaller episodes in the past 3 years that had required rest he'd given grudgingly and abandoned slightly too early both times, because he was, to the end, a man who found stillness harder than work. She had argued with him about this more than once. She had been right, and being right about it now was the most useless thing she had ever been right about in her life. Edwin was there. Their daughter Catherine, who lived 40 miles south with her husband and their 3 children, arrived by mid-morning. Nell came from her school, 60 miles north, and got there in the afternoon, gray-haired and straight-backed and dry-eyed in the particular way of someone who is saving their grief for when they are alone with it. The house was full of people for the first time in years in the way that houses only fill for deaths and births. And Margaret moved through it doing the things that needed doing: coffee, food, the practical management of grief's logistics, because it was what she knew how to do, and because stopping felt like something she couldn't afford yet. The funeral was Thursday. The whole of Harlan's Crossing came, or near enough that the difference didn't matter. People Margaret hadn't seen in years. People who'd been children when she'd arrived on the train in 1880, and who were now adults with their own children, and their own histories with the Hartwell Ranch, the library, the cooperative irrigation system, all the things that had accumulated over 32 years of 2 people working at something together. Hank Kraus was 81 and had to be helped to his seat but insisted on coming, and sat in the front with the expression of a man paying a debt. He'd been carrying a long time. Walt Briggs had been dead 6 years, but Helen was there, 90 years old and sharp as ever, and she took Margaret's hand after the service and held it for a long time without saying anything, which was more than most words would have managed. Edwin gave a brief address. He talked about his father the way children talk about a parent they've had the full complicated experience of. Not a saint, not a symbol, just a man. A stubborn man who worked hard and expected others to, and sometimes forgot that expecting was not the same as asking. A man who had been slow to say certain things out loud but had said them, eventually, when pushed. A man who had built something real on ground that did not make building easy, and who had been, Edwin said, looking at his mother, lucky enough to have done it with the right person. Margaret sat in the front row and looked at her hands in her lap, and did not cry, which was not because she wasn't feeling it, but because she was feeling it too much for the available outlet of tears, the way an injury can be too significant for the body to register properly in the immediate moment. She cried later, alone, in the bedroom, with the door closed, for a length of time she didn't track. The particular grief of 32 years, not just losing him, but losing the daily texture of him, the specific weight of another person's presence in a shared life, the morning sounds and the evening patterns, and the 10,000 small, unspectacular moments that make up the actual substance of a marriage, which you never think to catalog while they're happening because you assume they'll keep happening. She was 60 years old. She did not consider herself a sentimental woman. She considered herself a practical woman who had learned over 32 years that practicality and feeling were not opposites but different tools for the same work, and that the trick was knowing which one the moment required. This moment required feeling. She gave it that. Then she got up and washed her face and went back out to the kitchen to manage the logistics of grief. In the weeks that followed, when the house had emptied of visitors and the daily work of the ranch continued in the particular and different way that daily work continues. Regardless of what else is happening, Margaret sorted through Gideon's belongings with the systematic attention she'd always brought to organizing things that needed organizing. It was not painful exactly. It was dense. Each object had weight to it beyond its physical weight. The surveying manual with his marginal notes, the work gloves he'd worn through at both index fingers and kept meaning to replace, the coffee tin where he'd kept the original $43 when he'd first broken ground, which she hadn't known he'd kept and which was now empty but still there, on the shelf, because apparently he'd decided it meant something, and she had no argument with that. His desk was the last thing she went through. She saved it for last without planning to. It was a small roll-top desk in the corner of the front room that had been his from the beginning. He'd built it himself in the second winter, when the bad hand had him restricted to lighter work. She used it occasionally for the library accounts, when her own desk in the back room was covered with things. But it was his. His handwriting was in the grain of the wood in the form of old pen pressure marks. His system of organization, which was different from hers, and which she'd stopped arguing about sometime around 1890, was still intact in the pigeonholes. Receipts in the left, correspondence to answer in the center, things he hadn't figured out what to do with yet on the right. The things on the right were, predictably, a small archaeology. A button, a piece of twine, a folded newspaper clipping about a crop rotation method from 1894 that they'd actually tried and found only partially useful. A letter from the State Agricultural College about the irrigation cooperative from 1887, which should have gone somewhere else but hadn't. And underneath the newspaper clipping and the letter, folded twice and soft at the creases in the way of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times over many years, a single page. She unfolded it. She recognized the handwriting immediately. His. The same hand that had written her letters across 1,000 miles for more than a year, the same careful, deliberate script of a man who didn't write often, and so wrote with some care when he did. The ink was old and slightly faded. This page had not been written recently. It was a draft. His advertisement. The one from 1879. She read it slowly. The formal opening, the description of the land and the house, and the beginning. The line about not wanting a woman to take care of, but a woman to build with. The second chair. The promise to answer honestly whatever she asked. She'd never seen a draft before. She'd seen the published version, which she still had. She'd kept the newspaper clipping, the original one she'd found in Philadelphia, which was somewhere in her own desk in the back room in a small envelope she knew exactly the location of. But she'd never seen this. At the bottom of the draft, beneath the published text, in the same hand but written at a different time, the ink was a slightly different shade, the pen pressure slightly different, suggesting it had been added later, possibly much later, were two lines she had not seen before. She read them. She sat very still at his desk for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked through the house, through the kitchen, and out the back door to the porch, and she sat in the right chair. His chair, the left one, was beside her, empty. She held the draft in her hands and looked west, the way the prairie went, the way it had always gone from this porch, flat and honest and enormous in every direction, the October grass, brown gold, and the sky coming down clear and cold in the late afternoon. She read the two lines again. He had written, in the small private space beneath the advertisement he'd sent out into the world. She came. She sat in it. I was right. That was all. No date on the edition. She didn't know when he'd written it, after she arrived, certainly, but when exactly she couldn't tell, and after a while it seemed to her that it didn't matter. At some point he had unfolded this draft and looked at what he'd written in 1879 and added those 7 words, and then folded it back up and put it under a newspaper clipping about crop rotation, and not told her. Not told her. She thought about that. Turned it over. He'd been a man who said what he thought when it was useful, and kept things private when that was what they were, and those 7 words were apparently private, not because they were painful or shameful or complicated, but because they were simple, and some simple true things belong to the person who knows them rather than needing to be spoken to anyone. He'd known it. He'd written it down for the same reason people write things down, not to share but to confirm, to make real on paper what is real in life. She came. She sat in it. I was right. Margaret Ellison Hartwell sat in the chair she had sat in for 32 years and looked at the man's handwriting and felt something she couldn't have fully described, because it was not one feeling but several operating at the same time. Grief and love, and something that was almost laughter at the sheer specific stubbornness of him. The fact that he could keep 7 words private for however many years it had been, and she would never know how long. And the particular warmth of knowing that the certainty he'd had, that peculiar, unfashionable, unhesitating certainty of a man who put a chair on a porch for a woman who didn't exist yet, had never wavered. She thought about the girl she'd been in Philadelphia, reading that advertisement 3 times, the first time thinking he sounded strange, the second time thinking he sounded sincere, the third time deciding to find out. She thought about the train, the platform, his face when she said he was shorter than she'd pictured, and the way he'd laughed, the unguarded realness of it that had told her in about 4 seconds more than 9 months of letters had confirmed. She thought about the pump seal and the fence and the drought, and the winter the hay almost ran out, and Edwin's birth and the library, and the cattle disease and the irrigation cooperative, and the Tuesday when he'd decided without telling her that Ruth should be sold, and the Tuesday, different Tuesday, 32 years in, when she'd sat beside him and held his hand and watched him decide to stop. Tuesday, she thought. Of course it was a Tuesday. She almost smiled. The prairie went west in the October light, and the grass moved the way it always moved, the slow, rolling conversation of wind and root. And the sky was doing what Kansas skies did in October, going deep and cold and so blue it looked intentional, the kind of blue that made you understand why people had always looked up and felt that something was present in the distance, though she'd never been able to decide what. Nell found her there an hour later. Nell was 61 years old and had never married, which had been her choice made clearly and early and without apparent regret, and had spent 40 years teaching children in frontier settlements and had outlasted 3 schoolhouses and 2 superintendents with opinions about curriculum that she'd found incorrect. She came around the side of the house and stopped when she saw Margaret in the chair, and stood there for a moment reading the situation with the same quick attention she'd always had. She came and sat on a porch step, not in the other chair, which was right. "What did you find?" she said. Margaret handed her the draft. Nell read it, read the bottom twice. Her face did something quiet and complicated. "He never told you," she said. "No." "When do you think he wrote it?" "I don't know," Margaret said. "Does it matter?" Nell thought about it. "No," she said. "I suppose not." She handed the paper back carefully. "It's very like him." "Yes, infuriating man," Nell said gently. "Yes," Margaret said. They sat on the porch together in the October afternoon, the empty chair between them, and said nothing for a while, which was fine. They'd always been able to sit in silence, the two of them, had been since they'd come across that prairie together in 1880, a 9-year-old with a feather box and her older sister going to meet a man they'd never seen, toward a life they couldn't picture yet. "Are you going to be all right?" Nell asked eventually. Margaret looked at the empty chair, looked at the prairie, thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Nell had always deserved serious answers, even at 9, even at 61. "I'm going to be different than all right," she said, "for a while. And then I'll be all right." Nell nodded. "The library needs a new cataloging system," she said. "I've been looking at it. The growth over the last 10 years has made the original method—" "Nell, I'm just saying it'll keep you busy." Margaret looked at her sister. "Give me a week." "Of course," Nell said. "I'll stay the week." What happened next was not the dramatic kind of thing that makes good telling. It was the ordinary kind of thing that makes good living, which is different. Margaret got up the next morning and made coffee and went out to talk to the hired man about the fall cattle situation, because the ranch did not stop for grief, and she did not expect it to. She wrote 3 letters, to Catherine, to Edwin, to the State Library Association about a funding matter she'd been managing for 2 years that still needed managing. She ate. She slept, unevenly, but eventually. She kept the draft in the small envelope with the original newspaper clipping. The 2 documents together, the advertisement that had started it and the private note that had ended it, in the same envelope, in the same desk, where she knew exactly where they were. Edwin came back on a Saturday to help with the fall work, bringing his oldest son Thomas, who was 17 and had his grandmother's specific eyes and his grandfather's jaw exactly, which Margaret found she could look at without it hurting after the first day, and after that found she was glad of it. Thomas helped her move a section of fence on the east pasture, the same section that had given Gideon trouble in the winter of 1882, which had been repaired and re-repaired over the years so many times that almost none of the original material was left, though the line of it was exactly the same. "Gran," Thomas said, driving a post, "how long did it take before it felt like home?" She thought about it. "Which part?" "The ranch, Kansas, all of it." He drove the post again. "You came from a city." "Philadelphia." "That's a long way." "It is." "Were you scared?" She considered. She owed him a real answer. "Yes," she said. "I was frightened of a lot of things. Frightened it wouldn't work. Frightened it would, and I'd still find out I'd made the wrong choice. Frightened of the winter and the drought and all the specific ways the frontier had of making you feel small." She held the post while he drove it level. "I was also frightened that if I didn't come, I'd spend the rest of my life reading other people's advertisements and wondering." Thomas stopped and looked at her. "What made you come?" She thought about the draft in the envelope in her desk. About 7 words written in faded ink by a man who'd been certain before she was, and had the patience to wait while she caught up. Someone was very sure, she said, and I decided to trust the sureness. Thomas thought about this. Then, how do you know when to trust something like that? She looked at him, 17, standing in a Kansas field in October with his grandfather's jaw and his grandmother's eyes, asking the question she'd asked herself standing on a Philadelphia street reading a newspaper 33 years ago. You read it 3 times, she said. First time to see what it says, second time to see if you believe it, third time to decide. She picked up the fence wire. Then you get on the train. Thomas was quiet for a moment, driving posts. Then, were you right to? She looked west, the direction the porch faced, the direction the chairs had always faced, the long, flat, particular western horizon of the Kansas prairie that she had looked at for 32 years, and which still, on certain afternoons, in certain light, showed her something new. Yes, she said, we were both right. She helped Edwin and Thomas through the week, and they left Sunday morning with the truck full of the season's accounts and a list of things Margaret had identified that needed addressing before winter. Edwin hugged her longer than usual before he got in. She let him. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at Gideon's desk and opened the ledger that had been her father's compositing sticks equivalent on this ranch. The one she'd started in the first winter and which had accumulated 32 years of entries in her handwriting, the small, precise script that had been his first proof she was real and specific and worth writing back to. She turned to the next blank page, wrote the date, the fall cattle numbers, the fence repair from Tuesday, the library's quarterly report that was due to the county in 2 weeks, the state of the kitchen garden going into winter, which was, for the first time in years, slightly overstocked because she hadn't adjusted the planting for 2 people rather than the household it had been for decades, and which meant she'd either need to put up more preserves than usual or distribute the surplus, and distributing seemed right. She worked through the morning. At noon, she made herself lunch and ate it at the kitchen table where Nell had fallen asleep over her owl drawing in 1882, where Edwin had learned to read, where she and Gideon had fought about Ruth and about the fence and about who was right and been wrong in turns and been right in turns, which was the actual rhythm of a shared life if you were honest about it. In the afternoon, when the light was doing the thing it did in October, coming in long and golden and slightly sideways, turning everything amber and specific, she went out to the porch. She sat in the right chair. His chair was to her left, empty, the way it would be now. She'd thought about this. She was not going to remove it. She knew this the way she knew the things she was most certain about, quietly, without drama, without needing to explain it to anyone. The chair stayed, not as a monument and not out of sentimentality, but because it had been put there for a reason that was still true even now. He had put it there because he believed in something before it existed, and she had come and sat in it, and they had proven him right, and that proof did not expire. The prairie went west in the October light, and the grass moved, and the sky was the October blue. That meant the year was ending and meant nothing more ominous than that, because the year always ended and always came back. She sat in the chair and thought about what 32 years on one piece of ground had taught her, which was not a small amount of thinking, but which, in the late afternoon light, compressed into something manageable. She thought, the most important decisions don't feel like the most important decisions when you're making them. They feel like getting on a train, like writing a letter, like sitting in a chair. The weight of them only becomes clear later, looking back from the distance that time makes, when you can see the whole shape of the thing and understand what hinged on what. She thought, the people who are most certain are not always right. But the ones who are right and certain at the same time, who have earned their certainty through honest thinking and not just want, those ones are worth listening to, worth trusting, even when the trust costs you something, especially then. She thought about the woman she'd been in Philadelphia, who was intelligent and capable and trapped, not by cruelty but by the accumulated weight of the expected, who had read 3 versions of herself in that advertisement, the strange one, the sincere one, the possibility, and chosen the possibility, who had been frightened and sure at the same time and had gotten on the train anyway. That woman had been right. She hadn't known she was right when she did it. She'd found out over 32 years, in aggregate, the way most true things reveal themselves, incrementally, in the ordinary moments, in the stew on a February evening, and the pump seal in the mud, and the argument about Ruth that ended in the right answer, and the 7 private words folded up under a newspaper clipping about crop rotation. She came. She sat in it. I was right. He was right. She was right. They were both right, which was the part that mattered. Not that one of them had known first, but that they'd arrived at the same place and built something in it that held long past either of them. The sun moved west the way it moved west every evening, lowering itself toward the horizon in that particular unhurried Kansas way, turning the grass gold and then orange and then the deep red that always, even after 32 years, made her stop and look. She sat in the chair and looked. Somewhere in Harlan's Crossing, the library was open. It had been open every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday for 29 years and would be open next Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday without her needing to do anything to make it so. Because things that are built carefully enough eventually hold themselves up. Thomas and his generation, and the generation after them, would read in that building and not know, or particularly need to know, that it had started with 43 books and a 9-year-old with a feather box, and a woman who had decided that a town of 300 people deserved more than what it had. The ranch was paid for and in good order, and Edwin would manage it well, which she knew because she'd watched him learn to manage it and had not managed it for him, which was the only way learning actually worked. The second chair was empty beside her, and the prairie was enormous, and the sky was doing the October thing, and she was 60 years old and alone on a porch in Kansas, and she was not. She took inventory carefully, the way she'd always taken inventory. She was not fine yet. She would be. She'd told Nell that, and she'd meant it. But right now, in the October light, she was just here, in the chair, in the life they had chosen, which had been hard and real and worth every year of it, including this one. The sun finished going down. The stars came out over the prairie, thick and clear the way they got out here away from city light, the same stars she'd first seen from this porch 32 years ago and had never quite gotten over, the sheer quantity of them, the way the darkness out here was actually full of light if you looked long enough and let your eyes adjust. She looked. She let her eyes adjust. Then she stood up, went inside, and put on the kettle, because tomorrow had the same number of hours as every other day, and she had things she intended to do with them, and the only way to get to tomorrow was to get through tonight, which she was fully capable of doing. The 2 chairs stayed on the porch. They were still there in the morning.